Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for March 8th, 2021. I'm going to take up some of the strategic matters that we're facing at this point as we're seeing an ongoing accelerating collapse of the financial system. We're seeing at the same time an escalation of strategic threats coming from the desperation of the political and economic forces that are presiding over the financial collapse and are committed to the Great Reset as a way of establishing a global bankers' dictatorship to protect the bloated, debt-ridden corporations and financial companies at the expense of the rest of the world. This is the anti-sovereignty movement, the movement that's trying to destroy sovereign nation states to eliminate the obstacles to a global colonial-style looting policy done by corporate conglomerates, the equivalent today of the trusts that were responsible for during the period between the First and Second World War, for the buildup of both the Soviet Union and the Nazi regime in Germany, which created World War II. The same networks today are pushing a series of policies which are pushing us dangerously close to confrontation between the United States on the one side and Russia and China on the other, as Russia and China, for defensive reasons, are moving closer to forming an official military alliance. Now let me start with a disturbing report in the New York Times. Now keep in mind, this may not be true because the New York Times is one of the leading purveyors of fake news. However, it does fit what we know is the general direction of the policy so far of the Biden administration. So I'm reporting it to you just as a way of making clear that this could be true, and if it is, it's extremely dangerous. What they're reporting is that the U.S. is planning on carrying out a series of cyber attacks over the next 3 weeks on internal aspects of the Russian system, the system of Russian authorities. This would be in retaliation for the SolarWinds false flag, the allegation from the intelligence community that Russian hackers targeted the SolarWinds company, which gave them entry to 400 U.S. corporations and government agencies. This was never proven to be a Russian hack, just as the basis of Russiagate, the claim that the Russians hacked the Democratic Party computers, was never proven. In fact, it was proven from the statement of the head of the cybersecurity firm of the Democratic Party that they never had any evidence of a hack. That didn't stop them from 3 years of Russiagate. Similarly, the argument that the Russians hacked into SolarWinds is now being used as a basis of an attack on the Russian system to be followed by sanctions. Now, this represents the kind of insanity that puts the world on a course toward war. Without evidence, with citing intelligence sources which have been wrong time and time again, this is a terrible precedent to follow. Now, at the same time, you have Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, repeating the Pompeo line on China, that China is aggressive, that China is not just a competitor, but possibly moving toward becoming an enemy, the greatest threat to American security interests. And this is fitting in with the discussion of moving NATO further east. Now, as we've been discussing, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was originally set up to counter Soviet-Russian aggression in Europe. The Soviet Union is gone. Why would we be extending the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to the South Pacific to target a non-existent threat, namely that of China? Now, when I say non-existent threat, some of the listeners out there are going to say, well, China's our great enemy, China's a great threat. Prove it, demonstrate it. What is China doing? The Chinese are building their economy. For what reason? To challenge the United States or to uplift the standard of living of their people? If we had a competent economic policy in the United States, should the Chinese see that as a military threat against them? Maybe they should, because that's the way it's been used in the past. But to ascribe to another country the tendencies of your bad elite is an example of the kind of policy that gets you into permanent wars or possibly world wars. Now, the idea of Pompeo and others was you encircle China, you contain them, and then you use human rights organizations, you use color revolution, regime change operations to overthrow them. Who's meddling in other countries' affairs? That's the question that has to be answered here. Now, then you have a third area, the Southwest Asia pivot, where there's been bombing by Biden on February 25th of Iraqi forces in Syria. Where is this headed? Well, former Senator Richard Black, who's also a retired colonel in the U.S. military, former head of the Army Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, raised the question the other day, was ISIS responsible for the attack on the Balad Air Base in Iraq, the American air base? The U.S. blamed the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, which is a militia force that's been effectively fighting against ISIS and al-Qaeda, carrying out a series of actions to mop up remaining Islamic terrorist forces. So by blaming them for the attack, it meant that the United States was attacking one of the forces that's most effective in countering the terrorists. So Black raises the question, could it be that ISIS is functioning as a third force, that ISIS is targeting U.S. bases, knowing the U.S. will blame the anti-ISIS Iraqi militias, and then bomb the Iraqi forces? And what Black concluded is the wars in the Middle East must end, and the way to do it is for U.S. forces to be withdrawn. And he said, unfortunately, I do not expect this to happen. Now, finally, let me just bring up a recent post from Glenn Greenwald, because it's relevant for the same thing, because Greenwald is identifying the talk that there's an armed insurrection targeting the Congress, targeting the U.S. government, as an example of an extension of the security state, which was involved in the so-called war on terror after 9/11. Greenwald wrote that the Democrats are insisting that we're threatened by an armed insurrection, with the first phase of that being January 6th. And he pointed out clearly, look, there were no arms found on the demonstrators. But this is being used as the pretext to keep National Guard in Washington for another 2 months at least. And he said, in the meantime, this declaration that we face an armed insurrection, it gives virtually unlimited powers to act against the population, against the citizenry. So he said, while they're attacking their opponents as fascists, namely the pro-Trump forces as fascist, the Democrats are justifying, quote, the placement of more and more power in the hands of the state in the name of stopping these threats. And he said that is the core formula of authoritarianism, by which he should have said of fascism. So by declaring a fascist armed insurrectionary threat, they're using that as an excuse to actually carry out fascist-style state security actions. And he said in doing this, the Democrats are echoing the Republican neocons who are responsible for the wars in the Middle East and for the Patriot Act and the War on Terror. In particular, he singled out Bill Kristol, who formed one of the committees, Republican committees against President Trump in the last election, and David Frum, who wrote Bush's Axis of Evil speech, which justified the war against Iraq, as now the favorite propagandists of the Democrats. And so what we see is a coalescing of forces of the so-called deep state, which are really the military-industrial complex tied to the British Empire. Because what we're seeing is a repeat in the broader strategic arena of British geopolitics as it developed at the end of the 19th century and carried through the 20th century, was responsible for the two great world wars of the 20th century, and is now threatening a new Cold War, which could become a hot war. The same policies from the same networks. And this is what has to be taken on if we're going to eliminate this war danger. And the way you take it on is you address the financial crisis, which was caused by policies by these same networks to protect bankrupt financial institutions at the expense of sovereign nation states. So that's my report for today, and I'll join you again tomorrow.